We now turn to the Philippines, another situation of concern and struggle, but another place that is from which great solidarity with Taiwan has emerged. Bishop Rex Reyes, known to so many of us in his various roles, both at the World Council of Churches and CCA, where he served on various of the executive committees and provided profound leadership as the General Secretary of the National Council of Churches in the Philippines, now serving his own Anglican church in the Diocese of Central Philippines as Coadjutor Bishop. Father Rex, I always say Father rather than Bishop. I don't know why. Please, Patty Rex, take the floor and add to our enlightenment.
Thank you, Chris. Magandang hapon sa lahat from Manila. Same timeline with Taiwan. And I think we are vibrating on the same level with Taiwan. Thank you to the organizers, the TEF, for the space that you have provided us to engage in this conversation. Today, December 8, in 1941, the Japanese Imperial Army bombed Camp Janhei in Baguio City, north of Manila, prompting the Philippine president at the time to finally admit that the Philippines would eventually be a battleground, as was the rest of Southeast Asia. After the Second World War, Camp Janhei would remain as the main station of the Voice of America, a radio station used intensively by the United States to reach out to many parts of Southeast Asia during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. It took me years to connect the far-reaching implications of U.S. presence in my country, symbolized by Camp Janhei in Baguio, the Subic Naval Base in Subic, Zambales, and the Clark Airfield in Pampanga. U.S. presence in the Philippines was a controversial geopolitical issue in Southeast Asia region that raged on for many, many years to this day. It was an intricate part of the Cold War, Part 1. To this day, the U.S. gives regular military aid to the Philippines every year. In June 1991, amidst the debates in the Philippine Senate to renew or terminate the U.S.-Philippine military bases agreement, Mount Pinatubo volcano in Zambales erupted. The eruption wreaked havoc on the facilities on Subic Naval Base and Clark Air Base. The Senate action to terminate the military bases agreement was abetted by the eruption of the volcano. The U.S. bases withdrew. Since at the National Council of Churches of the Philippines and the NCCP, the National Christian Council of Japan, consultation in Okinawa some 6 or 7 years ago, Okinawa was also struggling with the presence of the U.S. naval facility. The move to develop the Hinoko Bay as the alternative site for the base was not only an issue on sovereignty, but also a serious environmental concern. The Philippine delegation at the time said, "We don't want the bases in the Philippines. The people of Okinawa doesn't want the bases in Okinawa. They should go back to Guam or Hawaii." With the collapse of the Soviet Union and other realities like the reunification of Germany, there was a lull in the region. But it would be a lull before a storm. It would provide a space to Korean churches to focus their attention at reunification efforts, for instance. But it would provide a head start for Chinese hegemony. Droves of Chinese would travel all over my country and Southeast Asia and elsewhere. And who knew who else from China would come to my country and in many parts of Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, globalization would become the order of the day. Globalization in many things to many people, with its feature of import liberalization, privatization, and deregulation. Weaker economies, especially in the global South, could hardly compete. On one hand, economists would paint bright prospects, citing indicators to support their claim. On the other hand, a majority would point out to the growing social and economic inequality and the inability of local economies to compete. What are the practical effects of the foregoing general statements in my country? Let me use joblessness as a benchmark. By 2010, when Benigno Aquino Jr.'s government took over our country, there was a strange situation. According to the Ibon Data Bank, which is the foremost NGO research network in the Philippines. On one hand, the Arroyo government in 2001 to 2009 registered the fastest economic growth, which averaged 4.5%, higher than any of the three previous governments, and registered a 7.3% growth in GDP. On the other hand, Arroyo left behind the highest record of joblessness of 11.2 annually. By the time Aquino took over, our National Statistics Office reported 4 million jobless Filipinos and 28.5 million in insecure, unprotected, and poorly earning or even non-earning work. Wealth was concentrated on the few and failed to benefit the greater majority. How did this distortion or the failure to enhance the development of the Filipinos take place? Ibon went on to say, the government created jobs prompted by export orientation and dominated by foreign capital. These were not integrated well into the local economy of the country. For instance, the footwear and the textile industries in my country, undeveloped as they were, spiraled down further. Our government failed to pay attention to domestically grounded industries. Ibon went on to urge the incoming government at the time to ensure socio-economic reforms and be concerned of developing a stronger domestic industry and agriculture. Sadly, unemployment continues to be a major concern to this day, made more so by the pandemic. This also explains why one can find Filipinos in many parts of the world, in your land, in your countries, and they work on land and sea. In 2018, Migrante, a watchdog on Filipino overseas workers, said the astounding 6,298 Filipinos left the country each day. In airports alone, departure areas for Philippine flights tell a lot in terms of the significant number of migrant workers. The so-called labor industry, as a major source of government income and trumpeted as a major fuel for growth. It is not a sustainable way. The trials and the tribulations of migrant workers, from illegal recruiters to abusive employers, and impact on the Filipino families is also a significant concern, even if the government hailed them as heroes. Most of us would call them modern-day slaves to distinguish them from others who have migrated with their families. In the last 2 decades, especially under the present Duterte government, China has had profound economic and political influences in my country. The ominous signs are clear. We have seen and we have watched how China flexed its muscles to demonstrate total control over Hong Kong and lay claim to Taiwan. It also flexed its economic might to many countries in Africa and elsewhere in the South. At the ASEAN-China Summit was held last November 16, President Rodrigo Duterte criticized the Chinese government for blocking and using water cannons at Filipino boats proceeding to the Ayungin Shoal to deliver supplies to the Filipino servicemen in the South China Sea. This was not the only time the Chinese Army and Marines blocked supply boats going to the Ayungin Shoal. But this is the first time ever that the Filipino president would speak strongly against China's aggressive stance in the South China Sea. Media reports in November 22 said 10 countries, Australia, France, Germany, Japan, the UK, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and the European Union issued separate statements condemning the Chinese action. China's foreign ministry defended its action as the boats trespassed waters. In a statement issued on November 18, the Chinese premier also declared, quote, China will not be a bully, but will always be ASEAN's good neighbor, good friend, and good partner. What is not being said is the aggressive stance that China has taken since 2013 to control those islands. The day after the statement from China, the former Secretary of Foreign Affairs of the Philippines, Alberto de Rosario, commented on the action of the Chinese Coast Guard and said President Duterte's focus on bilateral diplomacy did not benefit the Philippines. He said, we focus personally on bilateral diplomacy while neglecting the other tools in our toolbox, which would have enabled us to move the tribunal's ruling to the next level. The former Foreign Secretary said Duterte never showed interest in implementing the tribunal's ruling on the islands in the South China Sea. On November 20, the Chinese Coast Guard warns an aircraft bearing presidential candidate Panfilo Lacson as he was flying over to turn back and to leave immediately as their actions were unfriendly and dangerous. Upon landing, however, on Pag-asa Island, he saw the signs, "Welcome to China," similar to what was reported in June last year. By tribunal, Del Rosario was referring to the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which ruled in favor of the Philippines' claim to islands in the West China Sea filed during the presidency of Aquino. Ayungin Shoal, for instance, is 195 kilometers off Palawan, or within the 200 nautical miles of the exclusive economic zone. Duterte neglected this ruling many times, despite his campaign promises that he would jet ski to those islands and put up the Philippine flag. In the Ayungin Shoal, BRP Sierra Madre, a Philippine ship, remains grounded and serves as a guard post for Filipino Coast Guards. Faced with the superior Chinese Coast Guard, Rear Admiral Romel Jude Ong, former Vice Commander of the Philippine Navy, wondered aloud if the grounded ship is symbolic of the last stand of the Philippines over the islands. The islands in the West Philippine Sea are also claimed by several other countries, namely Taiwan and 4 other ASEAN countries, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam. Despite warning up to China has serious implications to democracy in my country, by the end of this year, President showed signs of an authoritarian government. First, he engaged in what he called the war against drugs and went on to publicly declare that the police can kill drug addicts and he will support them. This has taken a toll on young people in urban poor areas, while suspected drug lords had their way in court or simply remained untouched. Then he went on to promote red tagging or terrorist listing with the same tone. Communists are to be eliminated. By his own instigation, the anti-terror bill was passed by Congress that made the state security forces to determine who is the communist and the terrorist. The impunity that followed was astounding. The victims cut across society: professionals, church people, students, indigenous people, farmers, workers, and human rights defenders themselves. Under the anti-terror bill is the task force to end local communist armed conflict as the main implementing agency. They are the accuser, they are the judge, and they are the executioner. To be red tagged was ultimately a death sentence on and a license to kill perceived communists and terrorists. Third, the peace talks between the Philippine government and the National Democratic Front, which was initiated by President Fidel Ramos, himself an army man, in 1991, was demonized by the TEF-LCAC, or that agency, as a communist and terrorist agenda following the unilateral action of Duterte to terminate the peace process. Several of the consultants of the National Democratic Front were killed during Duterte's watch. Fourth, the pandemic response featured the longest lockdown, a corruption-riddled bidding process for medicines and equipment. Medical frontlines also complained of unpaid benefits. Meanwhile, his policy parroted or followed the economic policies that of China, mainly build, build, build. How then are we in the Philippines to deal with the global empire now led by two contending powers, namely the United States and China? The US has tightened US-Taiwan relations and insisted open access to sea lanes in the South China Sea. A Filipino observer once remarked that the US was raring for war. For us in the Philippines, we have taken a lesson to understand our engagement in a Christian way from the perspective of incarnation, our understanding of incarnational theology of Christ, of God coming to us, to be with us. So out of that understanding, we realize that we need to deepen ecumenical solidarity. Our young people in this country, and most of us who are called to be activists and sometimes labeled as terrorists and communists, are basic features of embassies who support undemocratic ways in their countries. So it is not unusual for church groups, people, to large, massive demonstrations in embassies of countries that abuse their own people. Deepening the ecumenical solidarity also means that it is a challenge for our churches to become part of the people's movement rather than becoming people's monuments. It's a choice between being with people and retaining the institutional character of our churches. While we have not seen the reunification efforts of Korea, for instance, it has not happened yet, but in my country, those initiatives raised serious, valuable historical and geopolitical awareness. Second, young people and indigenous people are at the head of the campaign for a just and peaceful world. They are articulating that kind of theological perspective where freedom in the person of Christ and in the person of the larger people's movement is present. Let the young and the indigenous people see visions. It is to this group of people where the idea and the charge in the Gospels that there are other boats in the lake. When it becomes difficult to pull the fish, then Christ tells us through Peter, call the others in the boats. And in this particular context, people shout, and only the people who are in pain do the shouting. Those who are not in pain don't shout. They rejoice over the misery of others, and clearly signs of what you call those who don't care at all. People matter is a perspective that the theology of incarnation tells us. The values, like the sense of community and sensitivity to others, are things that we see in those we often see as marginalized people. It is not so much the money, it is much more the people. They matter. When we forge bilateral and multilateral alliances, including those with people in China who still hold on to the basic concepts of human rights and respect of others. It is something that we need to do again and again and again, despite the persecution. Fourth, the vigilance and the prophetic voices and unity has become the points for common action for churches and ecumenical movements. We have not gotten tired in sending statements after statement after statement in many agencies in our country, as well as in many other parts of the world, church partners or otherwise. And last, we have held on to the necessity to continue calling on the international mechanisms, for example, the United Nations, to ensure that countries abide by their commitments. That is a very concrete way which we have been doing in the past, especially for concerns in the Philippines. Finally, our incarnational theology tells us that human rights violations in the Philippines are human rights violations anywhere. And the struggle for social justice in my country is the struggle for social justice anywhere. I end by quoting a verse from the early sections of the book of the prophet Isaiah. He shall judge between the nations and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And finally, before they end, I would like to greet my ecumenical partners and friends who are in this conversation tonight, and would pay special respect, especially to Natalie Lim from Taiwan. I recognize Natalie as one of my cherished friends in the ecumenical movement when we were together in the Christian Conference of Asia. Maraming salamat, mabuhay po tayong lahat. Good evening.